All right, well, welcome back to our lecture series for the paramedic program, and I'd like to start with Chapter 7 this evening, Body Systems, Anatomy, and Physiology. Now, most of you, if not all of you, have either taken an A&P class or are in the process of completing an A&P class. So this is just going to be a very quick review. There's a tremendous amount of slides with this particular chapter, so I'm going to have to break the sessions up into probably 3 parts in order to get through it. So this is Chapter 7, Body Systems, A&P, Part 1. And our objectives for this evening and through the whole series of lectures for Chapter 7 are to define the anatomy and physiology, define what anatomy is, what physiology is, and what pathophysiology is. You know, I think it's extremely important and provides a base for you as a paramedic to understand the human anatomy and how it works, particularly how it responds to disease. We're going to define homeostasis as well as describe the proper anatomic position for which we measure everything off of. We'll look at sagittal, mid-sagittal, transverse, and frontal planes. We'll list structures that comprise the axial and appendicular regions of the body, as well as name the body cavities, the different membranes that line the cavities, and some of the organs within each cavity. We'll describe the function of cellular structures. We'll describe cytoplasm, the function of cell organelles. We'll talk about the function of the nucleus, describe how cells reproduce, and discuss input-output of aerobic and anaerobic cellular metabolism. That's probably all we're going to get done in Part 1. Part 2, we might look at discussing the mechanisms that move substances across cell membranes, including diffusion, facilitated diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. We'll also describe the function of epithelial tissue, how tissue is classified based on its shape and arrangement, and describe the functions of connective tissue and relate connective tissue to the functions of the body and the organ systems. We'll explain some basic differences in skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle. We'll look at the nervous system, and we'll define the 11 major organ systems of the human body. At some point, we'll have you label a diagram listing those major anatomical features. We'll state the functions of the integumentary system. We'll name 2 layers of skin, as well as describe the function of hair and nails, and the functions of sebaceous and sweat glands. We'll describe the function of the skeleton. We'll list the parts of the axial and appendicular skeleton. We'll describe bones of the upper and lower extremities, explain how joints are classified, and giving an example of each type of joint and the way it moves. We'll describe the purpose of the muscular system. We'll list and describe 4 basic properties of muscles. We'll state 3 primary functions of muscles and describe the process of muscle movement. We'll name 3 main functions of the nervous system. We'll name divisions of the nervous system and state their general functions. We'll list and describe 3 layers of meninges, state the locations and functions of cerebral spinal fluid. We'll list and describe 3 divisions of the brain stem, describe the diencephalon of the brain, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord, as well as the peripheral nervous system. We'll list groups of cranial nerves and describe their functions. We'll describe the 2 branches of the autonomic nervous system. We'll identify primary endocrine glands and list major hormones that are secreted by each of those glands, and list 2 parts of the circulatory system. We'll list parts of the cardiovascular system. We'll describe what makes up blood. We'll describe the location of the heart. We'll talk about Frank Starling's law and explain why increasing preload will increase myocardial contractility and cardiac output. We'll discuss the relations among blood pressure, peripheral vascular resistance, cardiac output, stroke volume, and heart rate. We'll name the 8 great vessels and their functions, as well as describe the chambers and valves of the heart. We'll trace the pathway of blood flow through the heart. We'll describe coronary circulation, to include the epicardial vessels. We'll describe the coronary conduction system, as well as the cardiac action potential, and we'll describe systemic circulation. We'll describe the function of arteries, veins, and capillaries, the functions of the lymphatic system. We'll look at the respiratory system and describe the pathway of the respiratory system, including the nasal cavity, pharynx, and larynx. We'll describe the structure and function of the larynx. We'll look at the lower airway structures, as well as state the roles of the visceral and parietal pleura in respiration. We'll describe the general function of the digestive system and name major divisions. We'll describe structure and function of parts of the gastrointestinal tract, as well as describe essential functions of the urinary system. We'll describe the location, general function of each organ in the urinary system, and name the parts of the nephron or the kidney. We'll list the essential accessory organs of the male and female reproductive systems, and we'll give some general functions of each. We'll describe the sense of smell, the sense of taste, parts of the eye, and explain the functions in sight. We'll name parts of the ear, explain the functions in hearing. We'll describe isotonic, hypotonic, and hypertonic, and what they mean related to fluid in the different body cavities. We'll describe the mechanism that affects distribution of body water between intracellular and extracellular spaces. We'll define an ion, an electrolyte, an anion, and a cation. We'll define principal intracellular and extracellular anions and cations to include potassium, sodium, bicarbonate, and chloride. We'll identify physiologic mechanisms used to maintain acid-base balance. We'll give the values for pH and PaCO2, determine and help us determine when an acid-base imbalance is present. So in reviewing the anatomy and physiology of the body, anatomy by definition is the study of the body's structure. And I think it's important that we understand the anatomy of the body because it helps us when we complete a physical exam. It allows us, with that knowledge, to describe the part of the body that we're assessing, and it leaves no question to the reader or leaves no question when discussing with another healthcare provider what part of the body you assessed. It helps us locate body areas and perform different procedures, like knowing where the antecubital fossa is allows us the opportunity or allows us to know where might be a good site for an IV. Physiology is the study of body functions, and pathophysiology is the study of how disease affects body functions. And I think it's important that we understand both physiology and pathophysiology because knowing what's normal as far as function goes and knowing what to expect or what might be abnormal depending on a different disease process allows us to have a better understanding of how our treatments can make a difference in caring for a sick or ill patient. Now, we've all been exposed to the word and are familiar with the word homeostasis. And homeostasis just means maintaining a balance or a stability within the body's internal environment. You know, homeostasis is maintaining that balance. And it's an adaptive process. In other words, you're not always in an environment that is 98.6 degrees. Sometimes you're in environments that are very hot or very cold, and your body has to be able to recognize you're in that sort of environment and then make adaptation to keep you warm. Because cells, you know, they have to function at a certain temperature. They require a certain amount of oxygen. We have to be able to eliminate the metabolites of metabolism to include CO2. We have to maintain a relatively normal pH as well as blood glucose level. We have to have a relatively normal input and output related to fluids that we take in and we excrete. Homeostasis does also require a certain degree of immunity, our body's ability to fight off infection and disease. These things have to be strictly controlled. We can't be too far in one direction or the other when it relates to temperature. Certainly normal O2s are 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury. CO2s are 35 to 45. pH is 7.35 to 7.45. The blood glucose is 70 to 110. Whatever we take in, we should put out in a day's period of time. And depending on our antioxidants in our system, that has a big impact on our body's immunity and ability to fight disease. If we get out of balance, if we get too hot, too cold, if we get too much O2, not enough O2, too much CO2, if our pH becomes acidic or too basic, if our sugars get too low or too high, or if our immune system doesn't function appropriately, then we will be out of balance. And that can lead to eventually shock and death. When we talk about anatomy, the correct anatomic position is standing on your feet facing the person that's doing your assessment, with your hands at your side, palms forward. And other terms that we use to describe anatomic position include supine, which is lying flat on your back, face up. Prone is lying on your stomach, face down. And lateral recumbent is what some might call the recovery position. And that could be either on your left or right side, depending upon where you place them. There are some directional terms concerning anatomy and physiology. Anterior is the frontal or ventral surface of your body. Caudal is towards the distal end of your body, usually inferior. Cephalic is a position towards the head, usually superior. So when I'm referring to the caudal equina, is certainly a branch of nerves that extends downward from your lumbar region of your spine. When I talk about hydrocephalus, or when I talk about anything to do with cephalid, that's towards the head, usually superior. Other directional terms include distal. Distal means a position farther from the limb or trunk. Dorsal refers to the back of the body or the posterior portion. Inferior is towards the feet, below the reference in the anatomic region. So we have an inferior vena cava, and that is the major vein coming into the heart on the bottom side. Lateral is away from the midline. Left certainly is the left side of the body. Right is the right side of the body. Medial is the midline, towards the midline. We talk about a medial malleolus, particularly when starting IVs in children and adults. One of the sites that we can use is the medial malleolus. So that would be the ankle bone on the big toe side, or on the side towards the midline. Posterior refers to the back or the dorsal surface. Other directional terms include proximal. Proximal is a position near to the attachment of the trunk. Superior is above or higher, so the superior vena cava is the major vessel that brings blood to the heart from the upper part of the trunk or the upper part of the body. Right refers to the right, and ventral refers to the front or anterior portion of the body. If we were to have you standing in the correct anatomical position, which this lady is in the slide, we can divide you into anatomical planes. Anatomical planes are imaginary straight lines, and we have a sagittal plane that divides you in left and right, into a left side and a right side. We have a transverse or horizontal plane that divides you into an upper and lower. And then we also have a frontal plane that divides you into an anterior posterior. When we look at body regions, your body is essentially divided into two major body regions. Your axial skeleton includes your head, your neck, your thorax, and your abdomen, or what we often refer to as the head, neck, and trunk. And your appendicular skeleton includes the extremities, both the arms, the pelvis, and the legs. Your body cavities contain organs, and they are covered with a serous membrane, a membrane that clings to the inside of the body cavities. Parietal pleura, or parietal serous membranes, adhere to the cavity itself, where visceral pleura, or visceral membranes, adhere to the organs. Your ventral cavity, also known as your thoracic cavity, within your thoracic cavity is your pleural space, where your lungs lie, and then your pericardial cavity, where your heart lies. And when we look at the abdominal pelvic cavity, within there is your abdomen, and then your peritoneal cavity. And your peritoneal cavity is, your peritoneum is the lining of the abdominal cavity. So that's referring to all that space outside your intestines. Your dorsal cavity is on the back side, which includes the structure of your central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord. So that would include your cranial cavity and your spinal cavity. When we look at the thoracic cavity, what this diagram is attempting to illustrate, in addition to the bony structure, is the location of the esophagus, the location of the trachea, the location of the heart, the location of the 8 great vessels. When we think of the 8 great vessels located inside the thoracic cavity, in the mediastinal space, that space where the heart and the 8 great vessels sit, we've got the left and right pulmonary artery, we have the left and right pulmonary vein, we have the aorta, both thoracic and abdominal, and we have the superior and inferior vena cava. The thoracic cavity is bordered by the clavicles at the top and the diaphragm at the bottom. Below the diaphragm is the abdominal cavity, and we've all learned over the years that we divide the abdominal cavity into 4 quadrants. The right upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, the left upper quadrant, and the left lower quadrant. And the reason that we divide the abdomen into quadrants is that if a person has pain and we can isolate where the pain is at in the abdomen, it might give us an idea of what organ is dysfunctioning or is problematic. As an example, if I had severe pain in my right upper quadrant, that could be the liver, that could be the gallbladder, that could be the pancreas. There's a wide variety of things that lie in the right upper quadrant. There are many organs that lie in all quadrants. So as an example, your small intestine lie in all 4 quadrants. But it just gives us an idea perhaps of what organ is affected if there's pain in a particular quadrant. Some characteristics shared by all living things, regardless if we're talking single cell or we're talking multiple cells, which make up tissues, multiple specific tissue, which makes up organs, and multiple organs, which make up organisms, is that all living things have characteristics of being able to move, being able to breathe, being able to digest, being able to absorb and excrete, being able to be responsive to their external environment, have the ability to circulate things within their environments, and be able to reproduce. Now, a whole organism working together. I've kind of talked or alluded to that, is that when we look at the unit of organization, a cell is the single unit, and a collection of cells is called tissue. We have muscle tissue, we have brain tissue, we have heart tissue, we have lung tissue, we have liver tissue, and whenever we have a collection of specialized cells, we call that an organ, or specialized tissue. We call that an organ. So lung tissue is going to make up lungs. Liver tissue is going to make up liver. And a collection of organs is known as an organism. And this is kind of an important concept when we look at shock and we talk about the deadly spiral associated with shock. We have to find things wrong with patients, particularly when talking about shock, identify when things are occurring at a cellular level. Because if enough cells die, then the tissue dies. And if the tissue dies, the organ dies. And if the right organ dies, then the organism dies. Now, we can live without a spleen, and we can live without a portion of the liver. We can live without a portion of the lung, but we can live without a kidney. But unfortunately, we need, we need our vital organs in order to stay alive. When we look at the organizational structure of the body, the basic element of organization includes atoms and molecules and electrolytes. And when we look at what the body is made up of, if you break it down into an anatomical, or if you break it down to an atom structure, the vast majority of our body is no more than carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. I was once told that, if you look at the basic elements of what makes up our body, you could purchase those elements in a store for about $18. So some inorganic substances make up our body, to include salts. Electrolytes include sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. Oxygen, CO2, water. And then we have some organic substances. Lipids, which are like fats. Proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids are all organic substances that make up our body. Now, organelles are cell structures that are suspended within the cytoplasm of a cell. And most cells contain at least a nucleus. When we talk about ribosomes and chromosomes and all these other things, that's referring to organelles, the structures that are suspended in the cytoplasm of a cell. And cells are classified as I said this earlier, eukaryotes. I'm going to have to look that one up. And that's any organism whose cells contain a nucleus and other organelles enclosed within a membrane. And the eukaryotes include animal and plant cells. Prokaryotes are organisms without a cell nucleus. And they include things like bacteria. I had mentioned that a collection of specific cells makes up tissue, and a collection of specific tissue makes up an organ. And the general functions of different cells include cells that are involved in movement, your muscle cells, cells that are involved in conducting information from one cell to the next, and that's your nerve cells, cells that are involved in the absorption process of of electrolytes and water, and those include your kidneys and your intestines. And then cells that secrete, or secretory cells, to include your mucous glands. All cells excrete in the body. All cells must breathe or respirate. And most all cells reproduce. If it wasn't for the ability of cells to reproduce, you look at how many skin cells we slough off our body every day, and they are constantly needing to reproduce. Now here's a diagram of the basic cell structure with all the organelles that are located within the cell. And we're going to be going over some of these and their functions. The cytoplasmic membrane, the membrane around the cell that contains the cytoplasm, is bilayer. In other words, it has multiple layers. When we talk about intracellular, we're referring to what's inside the cell, and extracellular is everything outside the cell. When we look at the distribution of fluid within the body, we'll talk about intracellular fluid and we'll talk about extracellular fluid. And here's an example of a cytoplasmic membrane with all the different components that make that membrane up, to include membrane channels, to include carbohydrate chains, and things that allow the cell to react with other hormones and chemicals in the body. The cytoplastic membrane has proteins on it, and these proteins, or channel proteins, allow the passive passage of substances in and out the cell. And then you have gated ion channels on the membrane of the cell as well. And they open and close at specific times, allowing only specific substances to pass through. And it's enzyme receptors that will often serve as a catalyst for the reactions within the cell. Now, protein receptors bind to the outside of the cell. They are molecular specific, and they do change the cellular function. When we'll talk about the myocardial cell and the movement of protein in and out of the cell, the movement of potassium in and out of the cell, the movement of sodium in and out of the cell. Now, identifier proteins identify cells as good or bad, and identifier proteins are part of the immune system. If an identifier protein identifies a cell as bad, your body will destroy that cell through a process known as apoptosis, or cellular suicide. Now, carrier proteins facilitate diffusion or active transport of molecules through a cell membrane. And carrier proteins are important in allowing substances to move in and out of the cell. Membrane proteins shape the cell and adhere to adjacent cells to form tissue. Cytoplasm is a fluid-like material within the cell where the organelles, or all the structures of the cell, are suspended. It lies between the cytoplastic membrane and the nucleus. The nucleoplasm is the fluid contained within the nucleus. Now, organelles work as factories, and they all have specific functions, as we'll see. We'll see how the Golgi apparatus and how other organelles within the cell all have specific functions. The nucleus, as we had mentioned already, contains the nucleoplasm and carries the genetic material of the cell. The nucleolus is where the RNA is, which is responsible for ribosome production. Now, RNA and DNA are considered the blueprint of the cell. When a cell dies, it must pass that blueprint on to the next cell. A good example of, maybe not a good, but certainly an explanation of why tattoos don't fade is that when a person gets a tattoo, originally those skin cells receive a color, and they pass that color, that information, to the cells below them. So as skin cells die and slough off, the color of the cell that's replacing them is identical to the color that that was sloughed off. And this occurs, of course, initially the cells remain vibrant in their color, but as time goes on, the color actually fades. Now, cells without a nucleus, like a red blood cell, have really short lifespans. In fact, a red blood cell lives about 7 days. Now, one of the organelles that we're going to talk about is the endoplasmic reticulum, or the ER. It's a chain of canals and sacs that wind through the cytoplasm. It connects the nuclear membrane to the cytoplasmic membrane. It's essentially the circulatory system of the cell. It helps detoxify things within the cell. There are both smooth endoplasmic reticulum as well as rough as well as rough endoplasmic reticulum. And the rough endoplasmic reticulum helps transport proteins to the Golgi apparatus. Now, ribosomes is where new proteins are synthesized. It's accomplished through a complex strand of macromolecules of protein, the ribonucleic acid, the RNAs, and it's the framework for DNA. It's the framework for the genetic instructions on how to make proteins within that cell. Ribosomes are free-floating in very large numbers within the cytoplasm, and they attach themselves to the endoplasmic reticulum. The Golgi apparatus is a series of flattened sacs attached to the endoplasmic reticulum, and they concentrate and package material, and they help carry material to the cytoplasmic membrane. Now, vesicles are the shipping containers of the cells. So when material is needing to be packaged and shipped within the cell, it's accomplished through the vesicles. Lysosomes are membrane-walled organelles, and they're responsible for digestion of non-functional organelles. So lysosomes are like garbage cans, are like Pac-Man. They go around inside the cell and they digest non-functioning organelles within the cell. Peroxisomes contain chemicals that combine with hydrogen and oxygen to form hydrogen peroxide. And hydrogen peroxide, we know, helps clean and purify and detoxify even things in your mouth when you rinse or wash with a hydrogen peroxide solution in a wound. And within the cells, peroxisomes do combine with hydrogen and oxygen to form hydrogen peroxide and detoxifies harmful substances within the cell. And there are large amounts of peroxisomes in the liver. In excess, they create free radicals. And free radicals are normal and necessary for the immune system, as well as the ability to detoxify substances harmful within the cell. But when in excess, when free radicals exist in excess, we end up with destruction of healthy tissue. So in excess, free radicals are harmful. Here's just an example of how a lysosome will combine with a food vacuole and digest those particles that no longer are functioning. Now, the mitochondria is the power plant for the cell, and that is the site where aerobic metabolism takes place, or aerobic respiration takes place. Remember earlier we had said that all cells have the ability to breathe or respire, and it's no different here. The outer membrane gives the mitochondria its shape, and the inner membrane creates several folds known as cristae. Centrioles are paired rod-like structures that exist in the centrosome, and centrioles are important for cell division or for duplication of the cell. And here is an example of mitosis, or how cells multiply. And again, the centrioles are very important in that process of mitosis. Cilia are hair-like projections on the epithelial cells, and they help move fluid over the surface of the cells. Flagella are singular projection from the male sperm cell, and it's used to help propel the male sperm cell. Microvilli are projections from the cytoplasmic membrane, and they increase the surface area of the cell, allowing for absorption of certain chemicals. Now, most cells produce by mitosis. One cell divides, and that division is called a daughter cell, and the process continues and continues and continues. Now, many cells reproduce throughout life, and of course I've already mentioned how skin cells are constantly being sloughed off and have to be reproduced. Some divide until birth, and then once you're born, then they quit producing. Now, cells communicate with each other, and that's called cellular signaling, and it is a communication mechanism. And it's important that cells be able to communicate with each other. It helps you maintain homeostasis. It helps you fight infection. It helps with cellular reproduction. And when we have an alteration in signals that cause the dysfunction in communication of cells, that'll lead to things like tumors and cancers. Now, we have endocrine signaling, where cells respond to hormones released into the body. A good example of that would be, certainly insulin is a hormone that's released into the body, and with endocrine signaling, insulin is going to allow sugar to go into the cell. Paracrine signaling, that's where one cell sends a chemical message to surrounding cells. Autocrine signaling is where one cell sends a message to itself. Juxtacrine signaling is where a cell sends a message to the cell immediately adjacent to it. And synaptic signaling occurs across the synapse. And that's a signaling that we see in response to neurotransmitters. As an example, we'll talk about the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, and the neurotransmitters being epinephrine for the sympathetic nervous system and acetylcholine being the neurotransmitter for the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, cells must live, and we call that life, or that living, metabolism. So metabolism is the sum of all the physical and chemical changes that occur within the body. And the metabolic processes that we're going to look at include anabolism. And anabolism is the building of muscle. Think about an anabolic steroid. The purpose of an anabolic steroid is to build muscle. Catabolism is the breaking down into smaller pieces or smaller molecules. A good example of catabolism is the digestion of food, where we take larger amounts of food and chew it up into smaller pieces and break it down to a molecular level where the body can excrete the important nutrients out of the food. Now, cellular respiration is the most efficient way for cells to harvest energy that is stored in food. And there are three main stages of cellular respiration. There's glycolysis, there's the citric acid cycle, and there's the electron transport. Now, almost all metabolic functions require an energy source. And the major source of the energy within a cell is 7-carbon sugar glucose. The term oxidation refers to the utilization of glucose by the cell, resulting in metabolites, primarily carbon dioxide, water, and adenosine triphosphate. And adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is the true source of cellular energy. When we look at conditions like CO poisoning, that decreases the delivery of oxygen to cells, where cyanide poisoning actually stops the production of ATP. And the cause of death there is the inability for the cell to produce energy. Now, glycolysis is an anaerobic process. It's a process that occurs without oxygen. Glucose moves into the cell. There's an attachment of 2 phosphate molecules to the cell as well. And then through a series of complex steps, glucose is broken down into energy and pyruvic acid. It's not a real efficient way to make energy. Anaerobic process, or the process of making energy without oxygen, develops not much ATP and lots of pyruvic acid. And that's why anaerobic metabolism leads to metabolic acidosis. Now, the Krebs cycle is the second step in the citric acid tricarboxylic acid cycle. Oxygen presence is needed in the Krebs cycle, so aerobic respiration occurs. And aerobic respiration is respiration with oxygen. Pyruvic acid is formed during glycolysis, and it produces CO2 and adenosine triphosphate. Cellular respiration requires the electron transport system as the final step. And in the electron transport system, that occurs in the inner cristae of the mitochondria. Adenosine triphosphate production occurs there. And when we look at oxygen and glucose, the byproduct is carbon dioxide and water and 38 adenosine triphosphate molecules. So oxygen and sugar, aerobic metabolism, is the most efficient way for the body to make energy. The total results of cellular respiration, 38 molecules of ATP is produced. It's not 100% efficient because as you metabolize, you're going to give off some of that ATP in the form of heat. So aerobic metabolism is oxygen used with glucose to produce 38 molecules of ATP. Anaerobic metabolism, there is no oxygen, and the byproducts of anaerobic metabolism are lactic and pyruvic acid and 2 units of ATP. So it's not a very efficient way to make energy, but you can make energy for a period of time without oxygen. The byproduct, being lactic acid, builds up in the system and eventually affects the pH. Here's just a visual of the anaerobic metabolism without oxygen and the 2 ATPs that are formed, as well as lots of pyruvic acid, which develops into lactic acid, which lowers your pH. But when we have aerobic metabolism, glycolysis, just like in anaerobic, is going to produce 2 ATP molecules and the byproduct of pyruvic acid. But in the Krebs cycle, when oxygen is present, it's going to turn that pyruvic acid into more ATP. And mitochondrial enzymes working within the cell, within the powerhouse of the cell, are going to, with oxygen and sugar, are going to form 38 adenosine triphosphate molecules. Now, we've talked a lot about the movement of substances in and out of the cell. Lipid refers to fats and water-soluble liquids. And these lipids and water need to be able to move in and out of the cell. And that's all in part dependent upon the permeability of the cell membrane. Now, most cells are semi-permeable. In other words, they allow for the movement of things like water through the cell membrane relatively easy. Larger proteins, glucose, and other substrates may require active transport, may require something to help move that substance into the cell. As an example, sugar by itself doesn't move easily into the cell, but with insulin, insulin becomes the hormone that allows sugar to go into the cell. Now, of course, water levels are affected by overhydration, getting too much water in your system, and dehydration, not having enough. And both overhydration and dehydration certainly will affect how cells function and affect homeostasis. Now, diffusion refers to the movement of particles, not the movement of water. When I have a semi-permeable membrane, particles will move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration in order to equal those particles out. So you have the same amount of particles on both sides of that semi-permeable membrane. And we see diffusion used in the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide within the alveoli. As I had mentioned, some molecules need to be moved in and out of the cell through facilitated transport. Particles from a higher concentration will move into an area of lower concentration, but only by or with the help of a carrier protein. The substance needing to move in and out of the cell binds with the carrier protein, which facilitates the transport of that. And there's a picture diagram there to demonstrate that. Osmosis is the passive transport of movement of water. Diffusion was the movement of particles, and osmosis refers to the movement of water. And that in part has something to do with tonicity, or the solute concentration, allowing to give or draw water. And that concentration, if it's really high on one side of the membrane and really low on the other side of the membrane, creates a pressure known as osmotic pressure, or the osmotic gradient. And that's the difference in concentration from one side to the other of a semi-permeable membrane. Now, isotonic solutions have a tendency to stay where they're put for a period of time. As an example, normal saline is an isotonic solution. So when you start an IV and you give a normal saline bolus, it's going to have a tendency to stay in the intravascular space for a period of about 45 minutes before it moves out. Hypertonic saline or hypertonic solutions have a tendency to pull liquid into their area in order to dilute that hypertonic concentration. Hypotonic solutions, like D5W, have a tendency to quickly move out of the vascular space to try to equal its concentration with the spaces outside where it is. So osmosis is the movement of water, not necessarily the movement of solute or the movement of particles. The movement of particles would be diffusion. And the whole purpose of osmosis and diffusion is the body's or the cell's ability to move material in and out of the cell, in and out of the vascular space, and in and out of the interstitial space or the third space. I'd mentioned that the movement of substances across the cell membrane may require active transport. And this is where particles have to be moved against a gradient, moved against a pressure. The particle that needs to be transported binds with a carrier protein, and then that particle is transported through the membrane by that carrier protein and released. And this is how the sodium-potassium pump works. And the sodium-potassium pump within the cell is extremely important in regulating the amount of liquid inside the cell at any given time. During shock, what we'll see is that sodium-potassium pump fails and water is allowed to freely flow into the cell, causing the cell to swell and explode. Now, tissues is a group of cells with similar structure and function, and it results from differentiation. In other words, liver tissue is specific to the liver. You've perhaps seen the picture or read the story of, in laboratories now being able to actually grow specific tissue, to grow a liver or to grow a lung or grow a pancreas. Epithelial tissue covers most of the surfaces of the body, and it's in the interior of your hollow organs. And the purpose of epithelial tissue is to protect you. It's important in absorption as well as secretion and excretion of particles. And this is just a diagram that identifies the different types of tissue that you have in your body. Now, connective tissue is the most abundant tissue that you have, and cells are separated from each other by non-living material known as a matrix, like a skeleton, that separates the individual cells. In connective tissue, we see that in bone, and we see that in other types of tissue. Areolar tissue, adipose tissue, cartilage, bone, blood. Hemopoietic tissue is all subgroups of connective tissue. Muscle tissue is a contractile tissue. It allows the body to move. We have both striated muscle, we have skeletal muscle, and we have cardiac muscle. And each one of those muscles is under different nerve commands and has different properties. As an example, cardiac muscle is extremely unique in the sense that every individual cardiac cell will develop its own electrical impulse, and every cardiac cell will transport that impulse from cell to cell to cell. So I can chop your heart in 1,000,000 pieces, and essentially each piece could beat on its own. And that's just not seen in any other type of muscle. Nervous tissue is good at conducting electrical impulses. Nervous tissue is called neurons. Those are the conducting cells of the nervous tissue. Neuroglia are the supporting cells. They don't transmit electricity, but they're there for nourishment, protection, and insulation of the neuron itself. Organ systems. Organs are composed of at least 2 types of tissue, and systems are composed of at least 2 types of organs. Let's talk about the skin first. The skin is the largest and heaviest organ system in your body. The purpose of the skin is to protect you from invasion of germs. The skin houses the nerves that sense hot, cold, pleasure, pain, pressure. The skin is responsible for excretion of oil, excretion of moisture, and the skin helps regulate your body fluid as well. And probably one of the more important things next to protection of the skin is the ability of the skin to regulate your body temperature. When you need to retain your body temperature or retain heat, your skin pores close. You get piloerections or goosebumps as your body attempts to retain heat. And when your body needs to dissipate heat, your skin pores open up and you sweat. And it's the evaporation of the sweat that dissipates large amounts of body heat. Now within the skin itself, there are accessory structures to include hair, nails, and glands. Now the major organ systems within the body are the skin, the skeleton, the muscles, the nerves, the cardiovascular system, the digestive organs, the lungs, the genital urinary system, and the reproduction system. We'd already mentioned that the skin is the largest of your body's organs. It has 2 layers, the epidermis and the dermis. And the epidermis is the outer layer of the skin that is exposed to the environment. And the dermis is the inner layer of the skin where things like hair follicles and sweat glands and nerves are housed. Now hair is a small tubular structure. A hair follicle is the part in the skin in which the hair grows out of, and the erector pili are the parts of the follicle that allow the hair to stand up. You've heard the colloquialism or the saying of when you get an eerie feeling, how your hair on the back of your neck stands up. That's the result of the erector pili. Nails, keratinized cells, blood vessels, and nerves are all part of cells within the epidermis. You have 2 types of glands in the skin. You have sweat glands. You have mecocrine glands, which produce the fluid, and apocrine glands, which open onto the hair follicles themselves. You have sebaceous glands, which are found in the dermis, and they produce sebum, which prevents the drying of the skin and prevents the water loss. Kind of like a duck, may have lots of sebum and prevents water from being not only lost out of their body, but certainly prevents water from being absorbed into their body. The skeletal system has several functions. It acts as a method of supporting the entire body. Certainly gives you leverage with those long bones, protects your vital organs, stores calcium, and with the help of the thyroid gland, helps maintain calcium levels within your body, and our bones are certainly part responsible for the production of blood cells. You have long bones like your femur and your humerus. You have short bones like your phalanges. You have flat bones like your scapula or shoulder blade. And you have irregular bones like your vertebrae. Now, when you think about a bone, we often just assume, that certainly the bone is just a compact calcium structure. But within the bone, inside the bone, there's a medullary cavity that contains marrow, and then also quite a vascular supply. And that's how intraosseous infusion works, is that when we instill liquid into that medullary cavity, it rapidly enters the vascular system because of all the vessels that are running through the bone itself. The skeletal system includes the axial skeleton, which makes up the skull, the hyoid bone in the neck, the vertebral column or the spinal cord column, and then the thoracic cage. When we look at the skull, it's made up of not only the face, but 4 pairs of bones, 2 frontal bones, 2 temporal bones, 2 parietal bones, and 2 occipital bones, that when we are first born are not fused together, so we end up with fontanelles or soft spots. And those 4 pair of bones that fuse together as an adult become an inflexible box that does not give. And it has one opening in it, and that's in the base of the skull. It's known as the foramen magnum, and that's where the spinal cord becomes the brainstem. When we look at the spine, there are 33 vertebrae stacked one on top of each other. You've got 7 cervical vertebrae. You have 12 thoracic vertebrae. You have 5 lumbar vertebrae, which are the largest and strongest bones in the spine, because the lumbar vertebrae have to support the weight of your entire torso. And then you have the sacral vertebrae, which is fused bones, as well as the coccyx, which are fused bones as well. The rib cage is made up of 12 pair of bones, with the first bone being tucked up under the clavicle, and the 11th and 12th bone sort of free-floating. And each one of those bones wraps around and from the sternum wraps around and is attached to the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae on the back side that coincides with the rib. So the 12th rib is attached to the 12th thoracic vertebrae. The appendicular skeleton includes your upper and lower extremities as well as your pelvic girdle. The upper extremities include the clavicle, include the scapula, the humerus, the radius and ulna, as well as the bones of the wrist, the metacarpals, and the phalanges. The pelvic girdle is made up of several bones that are fused together. The symphysis pubicis is a very strong ligament that holds that whole cavity together. The lower extremity includes the femur, the kneecap or the patella, the tibia and the fibula, as well as the malleolus, which is the ankle bones, and then you have tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. Our skeleton needs to be able to move, so we have ways in which these bones articulate. We have fibrous joints allowing the bones to articulate or move. Fibrous joints occur wherever two bones are united by fibrous tissue. There are cartilaginous joints and there are synovial joints. Cartilaginous joints include the pubis symphysis, certainly the intervertebral discs between each of the vertebrae, as well as the growth plate on the end of the long bones. Synovial joints include joints where you have synovial fluid that help lubricate the joint and allow it to move freely. Certainly your shoulder girdle is an example of a synovial joint, as well as your knee. Now the muscular system, the muscles are the motor unit of the body. In other words, the muscles provide movement. Muscles are bound in fibers, and they're innervated by one motor neuron. And as your spinal cord comes down your spinal column, out of each vertebrae run two sets of nerves, two sensory nerves, which innervate the muscle tissues and the skin and those sort of things, that allow for sensations to go back to the brain where they're interpreted. And then out of each vertebrae there are two motor nerves, and each of those motor nerves then are attached to the coexisting muscles that allow you to move. So if I put my hand over a hot flame, my sensory nerve is going to send a message to my brain saying that that's hot. And my motor nerve is going to tell me to pull my hand away. And all this occurs as a result of the movement of ions, or the movement of electrically charged particles, both positive and negative particles, in and out of the muscle fiber, or in and out of the muscle cells. And in particular, the ions that we are concerned about include sodium, which is Na, potassium, which is K, and calcium, which is Ca. We also have negatively charged ions, which include chlorine, which is HCO3. Now there are three types of muscle. There's skeletal muscle, there's cardiac muscle, there's smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is striated, smooth muscle is not, and cardiac muscle has its own unique properties, as we'll talk about. All share the following properties: excitability, contractility, flexibility, and extensibility. You can stretch a muscle, you can flex a muscle, you can contract a muscle, and certainly muscles require the excitability in order to move impulses from one neuron to the next. Now, a nervous impulse causing muscle movement reaches the synaptic gap, and from that gap a neurotransmitter is released and helps move that impulse to the next part of the muscle. Now, one of the neurotransmitters in your body, acetylcholine, opens sodium channels. It floods the cell with sodium. It creates a positive charge inside the cell. And as a result of all that positive charge inside the cell shortens. And it's the shortening of cell to cell to cell to cell to cell, all these cells that shorten, that cause the contraction of the muscle. And this is known as depolarization. Now, certain drugs that we give, as an example, paralytics, fasciculating and non-fasciculating paralytics, will block and stop the transfer of acetylcholine and paralyze the patient. Myasthenia gravis is a nerve-wasting disease where the immune system actually attacks your acetylcholine receptors, causing muscle weakness and failure. And of course, as myasthenia gravis progresses, at the end of the disease process, because muscles are weak and fail, a person is unable to breathe and goes into respiratory failure and respiratory arrest. Now, repolarization is when the cell returns back to its polarized state. And this occurs when the potassium channels open up. And it makes this inside of the cell more negative than the outside. And initially it doesn't completely restore the resting membrane potential, but it allows the cell to prepare itself for another depolarization. And then here's just a diagram, certainly, that talks about the action potential in a cell, where that potential is measured in millivolts, and we have a fast influx of sodium, which causes the depolarization, and that depolarization lasts a while and then eventually wears off. And we see certain things on ECG paper that represent this movement, this fast-acting movement of potassium or depolarization, as well as the repolarization or resting of the cell in the form of a PQRST. Now, proteins are important for muscle movement as well. There are thick filaments of myosin and thin, light filaments of actin, and they're seen in skeletal muscles, but they're not seen in involuntary muscles. And actin filaments are surrounded by troponin and tropomyosin, and they keep the actin and the myosin filaments from interacting. When muscle is damaged, particularly heart muscle, one of the chemicals that is released by the damaged muscle is troponin, and we can measure that troponin with a blood test. Depolarized muscle cells also, in addition to changing the position of sodium and potassium, release calcium. Now, contraction of a muscle could be isometric, and that's where the length of the muscle remains unchanged, but there's tension along the muscle which increases tone or firmness. So an isometric exercise would be putting your hands together in a praying motion and pushing hard against both of them for a period of time. The muscle itself isn't moving, but that tension that you apply to those muscles help tone and firm the muscle up. Isotonic movement is where the length of the muscle actually changes and the tension along the muscle remains constant. So an isotonic exercise would be like a push-up, or an isotonic exercise would be weightlifting. Now, the importance of the muscle system is to help you maintain posture, and we talk about muscle tone, and that's the constant tension that is in muscles. If we didn't have good muscle tone, we would just be flab. We'd be unable to stand up. Any sort of muscle movement is an active process, and that active process generates heat or produces heat. But in order to move muscle, in order to produce heat, we have to have energy to expend. We have to have ATP in order to break down. So muscles need energy to contract. If you lack energy, if you lack ATP, certainly muscle movement is a challenge. When your body temperature drops below a certain degree, some would argue that's around 95 degrees, when your body temperature starts to drop, at some point, in order to maintain body heat or generate body heat, the larger muscles in your body begin to shiver. And it's the shivering of these muscles that generates heat and helps maintain body temperature. The nervous system, the main function of the nervous system is to monitor your external and internal environments, to take that sensory information that it's getting from all the different sensors in the body, and then coordinate voluntary and involuntary processes, or voluntary and involuntary responses. Now, as an example, some things I have control over in my body when it comes to sensory responses, or when it comes to movement. As an example, I certainly can command the movement of my arms and legs, the blinking of my eyes. Some things I can't control, the involuntary responses. And the nervous system, particularly the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, are responsible for controlling those involuntary responses. I don't have to think about peristalsis. I don't have to think about the movement of food through my GI tract. It just happens. I don't have to think about taking a breath, flattening the diaphragm. Those are things that just happen. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. And the brain is made up of the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And the spinal cord is made up of the diencephalon, the brainstem, which is divided into the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And the central nervous system is covered and protected by meninges. You have the dura mater, which is Latin for tough mother. And the dura mater is a tough fibrous membrane that covers the outside of the nervous system. Then you have the arachnoid membrane. And the arachnoid membrane gets its name because it resembles a spider web. It's a very loose connective tissue that has a tendency to contain and retain vessels, particularly veins. And then the pia mater is the membrane that fits tightly over the brain and the spinal cord itself. The brain stem connects the brain to the spinal cord, and it's responsible for all your vegetative functions. It's divided into the medulla, which is responsible for some of your vegetative functions. That's where your cardiac center is, and your vasomotor center, and your respiratory center. So the control of your heart rate is there. The control of your breathing is there. And within the medulla, we have both ascending and descending conduction pathways. The pons, they relay both afferent and efferent nerve fibers. Motor and sensory fibers. It also contains the apneustic center, your breathing center, and your pneumotaxic centers. The midbrain, again, relays both motor and sensory nerve fibers, and it too contains both the apneustic and the pneumotaxic center. The diencephalon is where your thalamus is located, and the thalamus relays sensory information to the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus is where your autonomic function control is taken care of, and your endocrine function control. So your autonomic function control includes your autonomic nervous system, your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And your endocrine function control includes the pituitary gland, which is the master control gland for your endocrine glands, your adrenals, your thyroid, your parathyroid, your pancreas, those sort of things. Homeostasis is controlled within the hypothalamus. That's where your motor function control is. That's where food and water intake is regulated. Your sleep-wake cycle regulation is there as well, your reticular activating system. And here's just another cutaway of that thalamus, hypothalamus, the diencephalon with the pituitary gland, and then the brainstem. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It's probably the part of the brain that we all think of when you hear the word brain. It's divided into a left and right hemisphere. It has 4 lobes named after the bones above it. So you have 2 frontal lobes, you have 2 parietal lobes, you have 2 temporal lobes, and you have 2 occipital lobes. And each of these lobes has specific functions. The frontal lobe is your voluntary motor functions, as well as your personality, as well as your reasoning. Your parietal is your perception lobe. That's where you can integrate the sensory information that you get from your sensory nerves. That is where speech is understood, as well as where we're able to complete complicated mathematical equations. Your temporal lobe is where memory occurs, abstract thought and judgment, and then the occipital lobe is your vision center. And then here's just an example of the different colored lobes, how large they are, and we've already talked about what each of those lobes are responsible. The cerebral cortex, the brain itself, gray matter is the layer on the cerebrum surface, and it follows all your cerebrum contours. And within the cerebral cortex, deep within the brain itself, is your reticular activating system, and that's where your seat of consciousness is. And the cerebral cortex is also where the distribution of nervous impulses to the cerebrum occur. You've got your motor area, which is your frontal lobe. That's your primary motor sensor part of the brain. It is where motor control occurs and muscular coordination and movement occur. Your sensory area is the posterior to your motor strip, and it receives sensory stimulus from the body and interprets its meaning. In other words, it receives heat, cold, pressure, pleasure, pain, those sort of things. The association area is the anterior frontal lobe and the lateral portions of the temporal, occipital, and parietal lobes. And that's where analysis occurs, interpretation of that sensory information occurs. The limbic system is also part of the central nervous system. That's a part of the cerebrum and the diencephalon. And the limbic system is where mood, emotions, fear, pleasure, sensations are all processed. Emotional impulses are filtered by the anterior portion of the frontal lobe as well. And you knew people that certainly doesn't occur anymore. If it does, it certainly isn't being made known. But back in the 50s and 60s, if you had a patient who had some sort of mental disorder and was very aggressive and violent, they would do a frontal lobotomy and remove the frontal lobe, which would make them seemingly harmless. The cerebellum is also often referred to as the little brain. It sits below the cerebrum, and the cerebellum is where your fine, gross motor coordination comes from. Your ability to balance and your ability to thread a needle and do those fine motor skills. And when we get to the portion of the program where we're talking about stroke and the ability to assess a stroke, we've all been taught the Cincinnati Prehospital Stroke Scale, which looks at cerebral strokes in the left or right hemisphere, but doesn't address strokes that occur in the cerebellum. So we're going to look at ways to do an assessment on a patient to determine that whether or not the stroke is in the cerebellum. The spinal cord connects the brain to the periphery of the body. The conus medullaris is the terminal end of the spinal cord, and the cauda equina is that fan of nerve roots that exits out of the base of the spinal cord. That's where your main reflex centers of the body is in that spinal cord. Impulses from the brain reach the spinal cord, and they're transmitted by the spinal nerves to the skeletal muscles. And so the spinal nerves aren't part of the central nervous system, they're part of the peripheral nervous system. And you have a left and right sensory nerve and a left and right motor nerve coming out of each vertebrae. The peripheral nervous system, that's where all the communication between the body and the spinal cord and brain occurs through the peripheral nervous system. It includes all the neural tissue outside the central nervous system. It includes the spinal nerves, and it's divided into two divisions. It's divided into afferent, or your sensory nerves, and efferent, or your motor nerves. And your motor nerves are divided into somatic nerves, and that's your skeletal muscles, and autonomic motor nerves, and that's your smooth muscles and your organs and your glands. I think this is a good point to end this part one of the lecture. We've been going at it about an hour and a half now, and so I'm going to stop the lecture at this point, and we'll pick up part two with the peripheral nervous system. Thanks. Have a great night, and talk to you soon. Okay.